This is my presentation on the impact of And the Band Plays On by Randy Shilts and how its writing shows Shilts' agency. The questions I had going into this included, what was Shilts' immediate impact? How did people respond then? Now? How did Shilts' journalism affect journalism to come? The answer and thesis I settled on as I conducted my research was, Randy Shilts' use of investigative journalism represented the agency needed in order to bring to light what the federal government had allowed to happen as HIV and AIDS spread through the United States. His work would go on not only to impact those of the LGBT community, but also how journalism should react in the face of epidemics. The overall of what this research paper spoke on is on And the Band Played On Politics, People, and the AIDS Epidemic, released in 1987 by Randy Shilts. This book was one of the first and biggest books on the subject of AIDS. Throughout it, Randy Shilts argues that the epidemic was allowed to continue and allowed to happen. He talks about the effect on the gay community as well as how the medical community and government responded. Following the publication of this book, there was an immediate reaction, both positive and negative. The positive responses being from how the book opened eyes to what had truly happened and how the Reagan administration as well as doctors and members of the gay community failed to deal with the epidemic. Shilts' use of agency was impactful, and this book continues to have influence on how we see the AIDS epidemic to this day, as well as shows what truly happened in a significant part of LGBT history. Who was Randy Shilts, and what did And the Band Play On entail? Randy Shilts was a journalist who was working for the San Francisco Article while compiling his work for And the Band Played On. As the epidemic started, Shilts began to write on the subject. As he in an interview with the New York Times said, "Any good reporter could have done this story, but I think the reason I did it and no one else did is because I am gay. It was happening to people I cared about and loved." And the Band Plays On focuses the blame primarily on three groups: the federal government, doctors, and gay community leaders. He accuses the federal government of a lack of monetary support and the simple acknowledgement of the epidemic. Doctors, a lack of care for their patients, and gay community leaders have been enabling the continuation of the epidemic through the allowance of bathhouses being open for much too long, due to their monetary contributions. Shilts was tested for AIDS, but he refused to hear the diagnosis until the book was published. He would be diagnosed with AIDS in 1987 and passed from it in 1994. HIV is believed to have come from the Democratic Congo from chimpanzees. It was first detected in the United States on June 5, 1981, after 5 previously healthy gay men would be diagnosed with a rare lung infection that would become associated with AIDS. By the end of the year, 121 of the 270 people that caught it died. By June of 1982, it was given the name Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, or GRID. The name would not be changed till AIDS until September of that year. It would not be until 1985, 4 years after AIDS was first recognized in the United States, before Reagan would publicly acknowledge it. As Shilts put in his book, people died while Reagan administration officials ignored pleas from government scientists and did not allocate adequate funding for AIDS research until the epidemic had already spread throughout the country. The primary sources largely used for this project was the book itself, as well as reviews that would come out soon after the book was released. Through these reviews, the reaction of the public could be garnered, and the true immediate impact of the book is seen. While Shilts' book was an immediate success, with reviews coming and speaking praises of what he had brought to light, it is not without criticism. Many people would overlook the message being pushed within this work and focus on the story of Gaetan Degu, who had been dubbed Patient Zero within the United States, and thus chose to use this work as a way of proving it was gay people that brought AIDS to the United States. Scholars have argued that due to this interpretation, Shilts' work did worse for the gay community than good. Scholars who have studied Reagan's administration's reaction to AIDS/HIV argue that going into the epidemic, Reagan created an atmosphere that would influence how AIDS was handled. Due to the rise of conservative ideals during the 1980s and the push towards Christian family values, the Reagan administration's lack of reaction and the public's accusatory reaction was not shocking. Scholars have argued that most of the early activism and action against AIDS and HIV would not come from the government, but rather from the people who were being affected. Another group which Shilts blamed were doctors. Scholars have argued that medical personnel neglected AIDS, whether it be from a lack of support or refusing to care for AIDS patients due to their religion. In 1985, AIDS was declared a medical emergency, and scholars have argued that due to the federal government's lack of support, there was little doctors could do. Shilts' criticism of doctors fits into this narrative created by scholars due to not only the lack of monetary support from the government, but also the lack of want to support. Scholars have written on how doctors have discriminated against their patients with regards to AIDS. Due to this, scholars have pointed out, the gay community had to exhibit agency themselves. Through this form of self-advocacy, scholars argue that LGBT people brought themselves to the forefront through the need to educate and bring awareness to AIDS. The gay community was brought together and given attention they had not gotten before. The Reagan administration encouraged an era of conservatism, which led to the reaction that this country had to AIDS. Through this forced advocacy, the gay community came together and advocated for itself, thus leading to further community and acceptance of LGBT people, whether it be for themselves or before the rest of the community. Shilts' publication of And the Band Plays On, as well as the book itself, are proof of this. Shilts' work brought people together, allowing for further understanding of what was happening to the gay community, as well as the other communities being affected by AIDS. Randy Shilts' use of agency through the writing of this book brought forward a lot for the AIDS epidemic as well as the LGBT community as a whole. Shilts showed evidence that it was not only the Reagan administration, but also healthcare providers and leading members of the gay community itself that's neglect allowed for the epidemic to occur. Shilts' use of agency allowed for the truth to come out behind the delayed reaction of this silent epidemic and the prejudice that surrounded it. Randy Shilts' use of investigative journalism represented the agency needed in order to bring to light all that the federal government had been allowed as HIV and AIDS spread through the country. His work would go on to impact not only those of the LGBT community, but also how journalism should respond to epidemics.